Welcome, everybody. Happy Friday, and thank you for joining us as we explore supporting college students with autism spectrum disorder. We'll wait about one more minute to see if more people will be joining us, and then we'll go ahead and get started. If you'd like to, you can see in the GoToMeeting Council, there has been a handout added, so feel free to download that and print it if that would be helpful to you. All right, we will go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome to Supporting College Students with Autism Spectrum Disorder, a webinar from the Autism Training and Technical Assistance Project. My name is Nikki Michalak, and I am the research coordinator at the Center for Specialized Professional Support at Illinois State University. I have a long history working with individuals with autism, their families and teachers, and their school teams. Many of the young children that I started working with when I was in undergrad and then graduate school are no longer in that K through 12 system, but I've had the opportunity to support their post-secondary transition now into higher education, as well as into helping them transition into the workforce to be successful employees as they are getting older. I truly enjoy providing professional learning and training, technical assistance, consultation, and coaching to educators and families and individuals with autism. I've created many online training modules specific to autism spectrum disorders, as well as coursework at the undergraduate and graduate level here at Illinois State University. I have also published in the field of ASD, and I'm very blessed to be able to provide a service on multiple leadership boards and advisory councils specific to autism. So that's just a little bit about me. And here we go. So the Center for Specialized Professional Support provides technical assistance. We develop publications and facilitate program improvement strategies for our partners across the state of Illinois as they relate to college transition, recruitment, and completion, always with a special focus on increasing achievement of learners from special populations. So I'm sure many of you have worked with or heard of ICSPS. So the Autism Training and Technical Assistance Project, the original Autism and Training and Technical Assistance Project was developed in 1997 and went until 2013. And that grant had a focus specifically on supporting children who are at risk of losing their home placement, their school placement, or their community placement. And so teams, someone that had a strong educational background, partnered with a family member, and we teamed up, and we would go in and we would build teams and help that child and family or that child remain in their home environment, their school. And so we did a lot of supports based on whatever those individual needs were. And so that program went on for multiple years, and then the way that the State Board of Ed was providing technical assistance changed. And then the grant was brought back about a year and a half ago. And so this is a partnership specifically between ICSPS and the Illinois State Board of Education. And when they brought it back as the Autism Training and Technical Assistance Project. And the focus really was to develop and share resources that assist individuals with autism as they transition from secondary education to post-secondary education and employment. As we'll talk a lot about, and as I'm sure you guys are seeing out in the field, we're seeing an increased presence of individuals with autism entering colleges, entering higher ed, and also who are looking for employment. The project also provides training and support to stakeholders. For instance, many of you who are on this webinar today are our stakeholders as you continue to work towards providing equitable experiences for individuals with autism. So that's a little bit about who we are and what we do. The Autism and Training and Technical Assistance Project, we have a website, and so I want you guys to be aware of this and have it available. It's autismcollegeandcareer.com. And so we'll talk a little bit about resources, but the primary focus of this grant, we brought a leadership committee together, and they helped us define these 6 different audiences. And so as you can see on the screen, these 6 different audiences include secondary educators. So that would be our middle school teachers and our high school teachers, educators, more than just teachers. The young adult with autism, the post-secondary system, so everyone that's in higher ed, communities, our families, of course, and then employers. And we'll talk a little bit about some data related specifically to post-secondary ed and employers. But we also prioritized our work. And so the bulk of the work where we've spent our last 18 months has been focused on young adults, the post-secondary system, as well as employers. And so if you do go to our website, you'll be able to see resources in each of the areas, but you'll see many more specific to those 3 different areas. So before we begin, just a couple of logistical issues. Again, I want to thank you for joining us today. Before we dive into the content, I want to explain the GoToMeeting webinar details. For you as participants, your audio lines will be muted throughout the webinar. We only have about an hour together, and so we could probably spend all day asking questions and problem solving with one another. So what I encourage you to do, if you have questions, you'll see on the GoTo Council, the control panel, there is an area where you can post your questions. So please post your questions there, and I will be glancing at it throughout the webinar, so I might be able to answer your question at that time. Otherwise, you can put your question in that question area, or you can put it in the chat. And we will go back and we will combine all of those questions together. And then we'll send out a follow-up Q&A document that is a response to each of your questions. And we'll send that out to everybody who has registered for the webinar. And then the webinar will also be recorded so that it can be accessed at a different time. Now, specifically talking about the content, we're obviously going to be talking about autism. And with any autism training that I do, I want to begin with the assumption that everyone has limited knowledge about ASD. And so we're going to provide a foundation, an overview of autism. That way we're all have the same information and a common understanding. We also don't want it to be too overwhelming. On the flip side of this, if there are many of you who are in attendance who do have a lot of information on autism, I hope that you don't feel it's too watered down. And we can focus on the strategies, which is in the second half of the webinar. And again, just make sure you capture any of the questions that you have, and I'm happy to cover them as we go on. So moving forward, You can see on the screen, these are our learner outcomes. These are some of the things that I hope you walk away with after our time today. I want you to be able to recognize when you might be interacting with a student who could be on the autism spectrum. We're going to talk a little bit about those characteristics of students with autism and what that might look like in a college setting as you're interacting with students who you think might be on the spectrum. And I'm sure you all have wonderful examples of what that looks like. And then we're also going to identify some strategies that can be used to help students who are in college be successful. So that's what we're going to cover today. So when we think about autism, what is autism spectrum disorder? Well, autism is a neurologically based developmental disorder. So it impacts the way that the brain develops. It's also characterized by difficulties with social communication and repetitive behaviors. And then it also is apparent, it appears within the first 3 years of life. Autism is diagnosed using the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and we are on the 5th revision of that, the DSM-5. But many of you might be familiar with how we used to characterize autism. So if you look at the umbrella on the left, you see 5 different disability categories. You see autism, you see Rett syndrome, you see childhood disintegrative disorder, and you see Asperger's syndrome. And then you have pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. This, I think, is probably familiar to many of you, and you probably still hear people talk about Asperger's a lot, especially as they're entering the college setting. I know here at ISU, when I interact with students, oftentimes they will still self-advocate and say, I have Asperger's syndrome, or I have Asperger's. And so that is one that you might often hear again. What they did is when they made the revisions to the DSM, they took out Rett's disorder. And they took out Rett's because it is actually a genetic disorder. They identified it's like the MCEP18, probably have the number wrong, but the gene that actually is the causation, where the mutation is, that causes Rett syndrome. And so that couldn't be considered a mental health issue anymore, as it was now under a medical reason for its diagnosis. And the same with childhood disintegrative disorder. If you aren't familiar with childhood disintegrative disorder, that is where there's a typical period of development anywhere from 2 to 9 years, and then a rapid regression of skill. And so it's very scary because we have individuals who up until 4th grade don't typically show any autism signs or red flags, but then there's a very quick loss of skill from that individual. And then pervasive developmental disorder was kind of the catch-all. So there's specific criteria for each of the disabilities in the way that the DSM-4 characterized autism. So autism, Rett's, childhood disintegrative disorder, and Asperger's all had specific criteria that you would need to meet to receive that diagnosis. And then oftentimes we didn't have one that fit every single person. And so if you showed many of the characteristics, but didn't fit into one of those other diagnostic categories, then oftentimes you may receive that diagnosis of pervasive developmental disorder, so that you could then hopefully, that would be a push for services. But then we reconsidered how we were diagnosing autism. And so with the new release of the DSM in April-May of 2013, autism was classified as a spectrum disorder. So we no longer refer to those pervasive developmental disorders, and autism now falls underneath that umbrella of autism spectrum disorder. And so there are levels of support. So when an individual would go through that diagnostic process, they might receive a level 1, a level 2, or a level 3 based on their support needs. But more often than not, it truly is just an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis now. And when we look at autism, we know that it's not contagious, and it doesn't go away. It is a lifelong disability. And despite what some people may claim, there is no cure. We do know that there are multiple genes impacted, and so we don't truly know the cause of autism yet. So therefore, we don't know what a cure can be. There are, however, many ways to compensate and improve characteristics associated with autism spectrum disorder. So early intervention is probably one of the best indicators of success for the future impact of autism. In addition to early intervention, we know that when individuals are in that K through 12 system, providing access to same age peers, typically developing peers, as well as access to the gen ed curriculum. Those are other indicators that improve the outcomes for individuals post high school. Those again were access to same age peers and access to gen ed curriculum. So the cost of not receiving early intervention for a child with autism is huge. And with those appropriate supports and services in place, an individual with autism can lead a very, very productive life. And this is my good friend, Nick. I have full permission to share his information. Nick is a college student now. And when he was 3 years old, he was what I consider to be like a 2 or 3 on 1 kiddo. He had some pretty impactful behavior. He didn't have any language until he was probably about 5 years old. And he didn't really start using that language in a social communication way until he was probably 7 or 8. I think there was one day where I was sitting out on his back patio and he came outside and he made a comment like, "Isn't it beautiful outside?" And none of us really responded to his comment because we were so flabbergasted that, holy cow, he's making a comment and he's trying to socially interact with us. So we were not good social partners with him, and we were caught up in talking about how excited we were that he was socially commenting. But he has made tremendous strides, and he is one of the individuals who I always say, you never know where our kiddos are going to go when they get older. Nick is attending college. He is a very social butterfly, and he organizes social events for him and all of his friends. And I'm excited to see where his journey continues to go. So when we think about autism, these are the areas that are impacted. Social communication, definitely their behavior. And I have yet to meet an individual with autism who does not have some sensory component as a part of their needs. So individuals who may have that same diagnosis, so autism spectrum disorder, may and often do have needs that are unique to them, their own needs. They're very individualized needs. And so one person with autism does not look like another person with autism. It manifests itself very different ways in different people. And so in the chat box, could you please comment on what are the areas that you see most impacted? Are you seeing all 3 of these? Are you seeing impacts in individuals being impacted in their communication and their socialization? Are you seeing some odd behaviors? Are you seeing sensory? So if you could take a second and comment in the chat box, what are some of those behaviors that you're seeing? What are some of those characteristics that you're seeing? I don't see anybody chatting. Because I'm looking in the wrong spot. Social communication. I see lots of socials. Social anxiety, odd behaviors. Tell me more about those odd behaviors. What odd behaviors are you seeing? inability to initiate and maintain friendships. So again, that social aspect. Not picking up on social cues. So you are seeing a lot of these. Rocking behavior. So some of those interesting behaviors, maybe during class time where someone might get up and pace, or they might rock, some of those sensory related behaviors that might be self-regulating for an individual. Someone doesn't like to be touched, a lot of sensory overload. Absolutely, changes in routine. So some rigidity in that behavior, inability to make eye contact, outbursts, jumping, frustration behavior. So what does that frustration behavior look like? Difficulty talking to, some more sensory related behaviors. Preferential sitting, where they want to sit with some behavior issues. So you guys are seeing a lot of these different behaviors in these different areas. I suspected so. All right, when we think about the spectrum, autism is truly a spectrum disorder. And so what that means is the severity of the impairment is on a continuum. And like I mentioned before, where no two individuals present the exact same patterns of behaviors in an identical way. So when we think about communication and we think about the spectrum, we have individuals who on one hand, on one end of that spectrum, are very, very nonverbal, meaning they have limited language. Does not mean they're not communicating, but they have limited language. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have individuals who are hyperverbal, or who have lots and lots of language, and use words like epiphenomenological in their everyday correspondence. And those aren't typically words that I use on a daily basis. So we have individuals who also, when you think about their behavior, are we have some aggression, we have some property destruction, and then we have individuals who are just kind of aloof, or there's something a little quirky about their behavior. Looks a little bit different. And then when we take a look at that social component, we have individuals who are very egocentric and very self-absorbed and into their own self. And then we look at the other end of the spectrum, we have some just kind of quirky individuals who have some special interests that they like talking about, might be very socially awkward, who might, when you're standing in an elevator, they might stand right next to you instead of standing across in their own space. So just some kind of awkward social behaviors. Somebody mentioned the touch when it comes to sensory. There's individuals who have described this as light touch is very painful. So for instance, if you're sitting at a booth ordering food and a server comes up and touches you gently on the shoulder, that could actually be perceived as painful. And so that they have very hypersensitive systems, or hypo. And the hypo means it takes a whole lot more of that input for them to feel it. So I've had individuals who I've worked with who have broken their wrist or broken a bone, and unfortunately they don't feel pain in the same way, and so it takes us about a day, or it's taken us 2 days to really realize, okay, they're not using their wrist in the way that they typically do, and come to find out that it's actually broken. So they have a very high tolerance for pain sometimes, because it takes a whole lot more of that to for them to be able to feel it. And then when we think about cognition, it was once thought that over 75% of individuals on the spectrum had a cognitive impairment. Actually, I'm going to hop back to this slide. This young man, when he received his diagnosis, he actually has a dual diagnosis of a cognitive impairment, a severe cognitive impairment. And if you would meet him and you would interact with him, there is absolutely no way that this young man has a severe cognitive impairment. But it was not uncommon because of that communication challenge, communication breakdown, that individuals were perceived to have a cognitive impairment. When you think of autism, I think of autism as a communication breakdown. And so all of the assessments that we use for to assess cognitive ability is based on a language-based assessment. So because communication is so difficult for verbal communication for some individuals, and oftentimes some of our assessments are using that verbal communication, it's a language-based assessment, so our individuals are not assessing out well. And so we can't get a true picture of what that cognitive ability is because we're not assessing them in the language of autism. We're using their weakest area to assess them. And so that's not really an accurate representation of what an individual knows. And so more recent data is pointing towards 20 to 25% of individuals with autism may have that comorbid cognitive disability. So interesting to know. So throwing this slide up there, comorbidity. Again, you can either use that chat box or the question box. What are you seeing? Do you see individuals who might have comorbid disabilities? For some of our individuals, they often will go through what I call alphabet soup. They might have an OCD diagnosis. They might have an ADHD diagnosis, anxiety, depression, a learning disability, before they actually land on that autism spectrum diagnosis. So it might take them multiple diagnoses till they finally find the one that truly fits them. Or in addition, they might have some type of comorbid. So they might have autism, but they might also have depression. They might also have OCD or anxiety or all of those. So are you also seeing that in your settings? Are you seeing students who are coming in with multiple needs? ADHD, anxiety, and depression? I would agree that those are the ones that we are also seeing a higher prevalence rate of. ADHD, yeah. Okay, so 70%, it's reported that about 70% of adults with ASD also have one additional comorbid disorder. So we know that some are diagnosed with these other conditions and then later find out that it might just be autism, and then they might have something else going on as well. This is our current prevalence data, 1 in 59. So this is from the CDC. This was last reported, the data, we did a prevalence update in April of 2018, just this past year. And this is data that was reported out from, I think the 2014 census data. Surveillance year was 2014. And so we're still digging through data that is a couple years old. There is some other data out there that says the prevalence rate is actually higher than this, that in fact it's 1 in 36. We do know that it is about 4 more times prevalent in boys. A lot of the big research lately has been focused on females because they have been an under-identified population. And so we're doing a better job at trying to identify what autism spectrum disorder might look like in females. When I talked a minute ago about the alphabet soup and how individuals might receive multiple diagnoses before landing on that autism one, this is very, very true of females on the spectrum. It's not uncommon for them to have 5 to 7 diagnoses before receiving that final one of autism spectrum disorder because it looks a little bit different in females. So I wanted to share some quick data since most of us, I think, are here from Illinois. I wanted to share some quick data on Illinois. This is data from the K through 12 system. And so in last year, we should get new data probably in April on what the prevalence rate for this current school year is. But in the school system right now, receiving services underneath that eligibility criteria of autism are 25,754 students. So what this tells us is, if you take a look at our 1 in 59, and then you compare that to this number, we know this isn't capturing everybody, and it wouldn't capture. This is only impacting, capturing students who receive services for autism spectrum disorder in the school system as their primary diagnosis. And so it may not capture everyone. Other students might receive services in a different disability category, such as other health impairment. Sometimes they're captured under speech language. And so we know that this is not a true picture of every student who has autism in our school system. Additionally, this is only for students who have an IEP. There are some students who have autism who might have a 504 plan. And so this is not capturing those students as well. To receive this eligibility criteria, you have to have an educational impact. And so there are some individuals who are not impacted academically. And so they don't need those types of services. Therefore, they're not included in this child count number. And I have been told there are a couple of questions in the chat box. And so I'm going to take a moment and look at those really quick. How do I know for sure if the student has autism or another disorder if the student does not reveal it to me? We are going to address that very shortly. We're going to talk about disclosure, and then we're going to talk about what we can do, whether or not we know that diagnosis. So we'll talk about disclosure and how what that looks like, because we know a lot of students do not disclose for very personal reasons or not. Sometimes they may not know that they have autism. They may not have the diagnosis. So we'll address that in a little bit. And if I don't fully answer your question, please let me know, and we can problem solve and discuss in more detail. Okay, moving on to higher ed. So we started seeing this boom of autism prevalence increase in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And so those individuals, guess what, are leaving high school right now. They are entering adulthood. They are entering college. And as we know, oftentimes we in higher ed have not been the most prepared to support individuals on the spectrum. That's not to say individuals have not always been entering higher ed, and we know that they have been there, but we're also seeing a higher increase. Just as those prevalence rates are increasing, we're seeing them enter. It's almost a new wave is coming through as they enter adulthood, and we'll talk a little bit about what those numbers look like. But we do know students with autism are increasingly attending college. And I probably could get a big head yes from many of you out there saying we fully agree. We're seeing students come in with these differing needs. So this is information from our own university. This is also information that is right in line with what research is showing us and what other universities are also seeing. We have students that are coming into college, and these 6 areas are the main areas that students are we're seeing difficulties with. We're seeing where the breakdowns are. So executive functioning, and if you aren't aware of what executive functioning is, that is that goal setting behavior. So we're seeing breakdowns in their problem solving, in their time management. And those are all things that are a part of executive functioning. We're seeing breakdowns in communication. We're seeing social skill issues, and many of you definitely are noted that in our questions, that you are also seeing some of those social skill and communication breakdowns. We're seeing difficulties with campus life. And right along with that is that independent living. And so that's a huge area when individuals have been living with their families. Sometimes they continue to live with their families. Other times they might live in the college housing. And so navigating living with another person, I mean, for anyone that is difficult. You add in some of the other challenges that an individual with autism might have, or skill areas that they need to further develop. And so that's why independent living can be a very, very difficult area to navigate and to learn. And then the sensory challenges. And we mentioned some of those when we were talking about some of those rocking behaviors and pacing behaviors, especially if you're in a classroom and you have individuals who are engaging in some of the, self-talk or rocking consistently. Some of those behaviors might be distracting to others within that learning environment. And so these are some of the challenges that we are seeing across the board as individuals with autism are entering college. What do you think of these? Are these what you guys are also seeing? Is there anything else, not in these big categories, that you're seeing that is different? Yes, you're seeing this too. Not knowing how to self-advocate, absolutely. That self-determination and self-advocacy goes along in each one of these areas. So moving right along. All right, so here's some data. By 2020, it is estimated that 500,000 individuals with autism are expected to reach adulthood. So like I said, that wave is coming through. It is truly coming through. In addition to that, 35% of young adults have not had a job or received postgraduate education after leaving high school. So what are they doing? Oftentimes, they're hanging out at home. Pretty scary. Bleak numbers right there. And as we continue, when we look specifically at post-secondary, the presence of autism, students with autism, is increasing. We've mentioned that. We all know that. That's why we're all here today. But we don't have really good data because we mentioned the disclosure. Sometimes individuals don't disclose, therefore they're not receiving services through their disability office. So we don't have a really accurate number of how many students truly are on all of our campuses. But what we do know of those, there is a high incompletion rate. We have students who do have autism who are attending school, college, higher ed. However, that dropout rate is high, and there's multiple reasons for that. But what we're also seeing is students who are entering, they're entering unprepared in those areas of social communication. So how to interact with my peers, how to interact with an instructor, how to self-advocate. And then also in that big broader area of executive functioning. So this is what we're seeing across the board. But what we do know is we have this big focus now on neurodiversity. So across campuses as a whole, we're seeing increased visibility of students with disabilities. Many of our colleges, we have this commitment to diversity and inclusion, especially when we look at special populations in post-secondary education. And then of course we have laws that help guide what we have to be doing. And so truly where we're at right now, we're at a new era for post-secondary ed. We have students that are coming through who we are going to be supporting or need to be supporting a little bit differently. So here's our disclosure information. Often students with autism do not report their disability. That is that student's choice. Sometimes they don't do it for many reasons. If a student is going to receive accommodations, they will need to disclose. So that is something that they have to get in contact with that disability service office. to work out, and then that student does need to share their letter, their accommodation letter, with you as an instructor so that you know how you could best support that student. Sometimes for students, this disclosing is very challenging because of the self-awareness, the self-advocating that may or may not happen. Sometimes because of those communication breakdowns and the difficulties with that social component, social interactions, and then asking for help. Sometimes that's a really, really hard thing to do. Especially if you take a look at the way that our K through 12 system is set up, we often have people who are supporting the individual and doing this for them all the time. And so from the moment they are in that K through 12 system, we are supporting them. And then when it's a service cliff, when they graduate, mom and dad aren't always, or a teacher isn't there to do it for them. Oftentimes mom and dad are there, and so that does help support that student. And that parent involvement looks a little bit different once we get to college, but we can use that to our benefit, and have those parents help support individuals as they're navigating the college setting. And also, just to throw it out there, just because you notice some of the characteristics that they may or may not have shared, or that you've learned are specific and related to autism, it's best to not make assumptions. And so what I always say is, you're going to differentiate. We have so many individuals who are coming to our campuses who have different needs. And so to me, knowing that someone has autism, yes, that gives me a little bit of background about some of the supports and the ways that I could support them, but it truly means that you're going to have to individualize some of your instruction based on that individual's needs, whether or not you know they have a disability or not. We can still individualize and provide access to things not based on someone having a disability. So here are some of the things that many of you might have mentioned earlier. So when we think about what does it look like in a campus setting, in a classroom, oftentimes we might have individuals who have a difficult time with perspective taking. They may lack that social understanding. They may have difficulties with metaphors or jokes or sarcasm. And so oftentimes we call this a lack of theory of mind also, where they may say something and they automatically assume that what they're thinking is in your head. And oftentimes it's not. And so we see a breakdown sometimes in what that looks like. And so this might also impact group work when individuals have to take perspectives, and obviously group work is shared collaboration, and there's so many other skills that are involved in group work, and so group work is often very difficult because you have a difficult time understanding other people's facial expressions, or oftentimes what happens is if someone is very academically driven, they might want to, dive in and do the work. And so sharing some of those responsibilities, if they're not very specifically outlined, is difficult. We also, you might see, we talked about the communication. And so you see some of the bullets here that are some of those indicators and descriptors of what that odd communication might look like. You also might see a sensitivity to environmental stimuli. So someone might be hyper-reactive or hypo. On the opposite side, you might see someone who takes a lot more of that input stimuli to see an effect. I think I did remember seeing somebody talk about that rigidity in behavior. So rules and problem solving is sometimes very difficult. Sometimes individuals focus so much on the details that they fail to see the big picture. And then routine is very, very important. And so when things are not routine, when there's a change, sometimes that's very difficult. And so see, these are just a few of the examples that you might see when you're supporting someone on the spectrum. So then what do we do? How can we support somebody a little bit better? So you'll see, I'm going to go through these pretty quickly because we're only scheduled for another 15 minutes and I could probably talk about these for another 6 hours. And I'll share an opportunity of when we can come back together and talk more specifically about strategies and what they might look like in a classroom setting. But specifically, these are some things that you can do in a classroom setting. And I'll just highlight a few of them. So when you're talking to a student, use their name. That way the student knows you're specifically talking to them. Again, I think I just mentioned this, but truly minimize your use of metaphors and figurative language. We don't really realize how many metaphors we speak in. I had the opportunity to go train in Thailand a couple years ago. And we had a translator as we were providing a workshop, a 2-day workshop to administrators within Thailand. And our translator had to stop and turn and look at us and say, there is no way to translate what you're saying because we speak in so many metaphors and idioms that those are very, very hard for individuals to understand and to break down. And so minimize, it's really hard. You have to have a very, be aware of what it is that you're saying, but minimize your use of metaphors and that figurative language, including sarcasm. I say our students often have a broken sarcasm meter. They truly don't understand it. Check for understanding. Sometimes problems arise simply because the person does not understand what it is that he did wrong. And oftentimes if we can address where that breakdown is, then we can move through and correct whatever that issue was. If you need someone to do something specific, take bigger projects and truly break them down. Sometimes just sitting down with a student and breaking down a larger task into smaller steps, step by step, that will help outline and be very specific in what those expectations are. And then lastly, remember that we talked about this communication. Individuals with autism, they might have breakdowns with communication skills. They might have a difficult time trying to come up with the right words to say. Or for instance, there was an instructor who was sharing, they had just set their students up in groups and she was going to check with the group and the student threw his hand out and said, "Stop right there, not now." And it came across as being very loud, and the instructor interpreted that as the student was, a little abrasive, but the student didn't mean that. The student meant, "Stop, we haven't had a time to talk yet. I'm not ready for you right now. So come back later." However, that's not what was initially communicated to the instructor. So I often say they have a faulty filter. And so we just have to look a little bit further and use our problem solving hats. So here's a few more classroom recommendations. Again, be explicit with your directions and expectations. We often, when we're teaching lecture, we use that verbal a lot. However, we know that auditory channel is the weakest link for individuals with autism. So whenever we can provide something visually, provide that in writing. That's only going to support the individual. And going right along with that, make sure you post critical information such as due dates, rubrics, sample work, ask for clarification. And then another thing is give students choice for the projects or assignments. A lot of individuals on the spectrum have a special interest area. And so if they can integrate that special interest area into that project or assignment, there's going to be an increased motivation for individuals to complete that work. And so anytime you can use that special interest area, do it. It helps. It's motivating. When you think about assignments, many of our students, and many without ASD, I'm a very concrete, literal person, but our individuals with autism are often very concrete, linear thinkers. They're black and white. The gray area doesn't make a whole lot of sense to them. So make sure you're providing information that is very concrete, black and white. take some time to work one-on-one with students whenever possible. And if you're not able to, hook them up with a GA or a teaching assistant so that they can get that additional support. What I will say is sometimes you might have to also be very explicit in boundaries. I've had individuals with autism who have followed me back to my office hours, and I have to say, I have to meet with other students. You can come and you can meet with me for 30 minutes once a week. And so it is okay to be that specific. And you don't have to think that you are being rude. It's providing those boundaries. And those truly do help, being very explicit in those expectations again. But that boundary is something that will help guide that student so that they don't think they can follow you back to your office hour and talk for the next 2 hours, because I'm sure that's happened to many of you. Organization, our students struggle. Again, that goes back to that executive functioning breakdown. Oftentimes students need support with organization. And so you might just have to help them a little bit with how to organize an assignment, how to think about, here's a timeline, here's how you can get this work done. And that might not be what you do for all, but that's what you might need to do for some of your students. When you think about group work is very, very difficult, as we've mentioned. So try when you're pairing students, if you have the ability to hook them up with a good peer mentor that could help that. Again, being very specific in what role you want the student to take within that group is a great idea. And then I often check in with my groups. I am a big proponent of using Google Docs when I have my students do group work. That way I can pop in and I can monitor groups. And so I oftentimes will set up a Google Doc folder for my students, and then I can go in and I can, if they're working in a Google Doc or if they're working on a slides, then I can go in and I can see some of that history and how that interaction looks and read some of the comments, just so that I'm aware of what's going on. And I don't always do that. But if I set that structure up and there is a breakdown, then I'm able to go back in and I can see where some of that breakdown happens. So, and then you can address the student ahead of time. Oftentimes in the K through 12 system, we might call this pre-teaching, where I go in and I might give a little information ahead of time just to prep and to make a student aware of what's coming down the pipe. And that's still a great strategy to use. Peer interactions. Like I said before, one of the best predictors of post-school outcomes is using peers. Peers are an evidence-based practice using peer mentors. So anytime we can pair individuals up with another person, that is a great strategy. But also know that students with autism, they live in that same world that we do. However, their perception of what's happening, their interpretation, can be very, very different from our own. Their perspective is very valid, even if it is very unique. However, we need to make sure that we can clarify anything that we can about that social interaction or navigating that social environment, so that people don't have a misconception of what's going on. We often say individuals want to have friends, but they just may not know how to make friends. And that's no different when individuals get to college. Some of the research that I've read is from individuals on the spectrum has truly said that that social component is the hardest for them to capture and navigate. They want to have friends, they just don't understand how to maintain that friendship. So do know that that is a very difficult area for individuals on the spectrum. I'm gonna leave these for you guys to read through in the handouts. The one thing I do want to clarify on this slide, though, is one thing that you can do that might be helpful is find out how the student prefers to communicate. It might be helpful to have email as one of those communication tools, just so that you can have everything in writing. And that way, when you do meet one-on-one with a student, you can go back and you can print out some of that correspondence, and you can highlight and you can build from what you had in your written communication. So that's a really good tool and idea to use as you're interacting with students. I'm going to hop over this one really quick, and I want to get to talk really quickly about a few more supports. I'm sure all of these sound very, very familiar to you. These are accommodations that are available to a lot of our students on the spectrum. that are a no surprise. But what I really want to talk about and really focus on are the little a accommodations. And little a accommodations, are you doing these? Are you doing these on your campuses when you're supporting students? These are, I feel like, some of the areas that we truly need to focus on. So we know that we can provide extended time, a private room, a note taker. And these are all great accommodations, but they may not necessarily fit the needs of our students who are on the spectrum. Instead, we might need to facilitate some of those social interactions and create some of those social connections. And that might be connecting them with groups. Maybe it is how, offering a social skills group. Maybe that is doing out of the typical 9 to 5 day work where you check in at 8 o'clock at night with an individual, do wellness checks. And so these listed here are just some other ideas of things that you can do to support individuals on the spectrum. And then when it comes down to it, these are things that I always say anyone can do. Individuals with spectrum, they're very rule bound. They are routined individuals. And so rather than respond to a fluid environment, if you can provide rules and expectations, that's going to help. That's going to make sense to individuals with autism. So anytime that you can structure up an unstructured environment, the more structure that you can provide will probably help. Anytime that we can create routine, predictability and consistency are key. It's those interruptions to those routines that might cause anxiety and stress to increase. Those surprises that might happen, those are stress inducing. So when we can create those routines and individuals can predict what's going to happen in the future and provide as much information up front, that's going to decrease those that stress. So what I'd like to hop to here is, here's some other things that you can do. If you hop to our website, you will see underneath the post-secondary area, there is a fact sheet, Autism Spectrum Disorder Tips for Faculty. What can I do? So here is some of the information that we just covered, captured in a handout. And then always, we talk about employment. That was the next area that I was going to go to. You have that information in your notes. I could talk about this, I guess, forever. So I'm sorry I included too much information. And it is about 2 minutes before 11, and I will stop here. But what I want you to also do is go to that to the website. You will also see Brittany just posted in the chat box. We are going to host an upcoming workshop on April 26th. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus a little bit more on strategies. We're going to talk about many of the resources and tools that have been developed and how can you apply that to the students that you're supporting. So it will be a full day workshop. We will cover kind of the strategies, the implementation of what can I do. We can problem solve, we'll have some case studies, and we'll make it very specific so that you can walk away having a better understanding of what you can do to support individuals on the spectrum. And then I did notice as we're wrapping up, somebody did put in the chat, here at ISU, I don't know how close many of you are, but Temple Grandin is coming to ISU. I am so excited. She will be here Wednesday, April 10th, and she'll be at the Bone Student Center. So if you have not had an opportunity to hear Temple Grandin speak, I highly recommend doing a quick Google search. She has some amazing TED Talks out there. She is an individual with autism spectrum disorder. She teaches at Colorado State University. I think she did her graduate work at U of I, and she actually is very well known in the ag industry for creating designing the cattle chute that animals will go through before they are slaughtered. She is amazing, but she has autism. There's a movie out that Claire Danes, Temple Grandin, Claire Danes plays her. So if you are available the evening of April 10th, I highly recommend popping in and seeing her. So I appreciate your time. I hope you're walking away with at least a better understanding of some of the students that you might be supporting, and then maybe a couple of different ways that you can provide assistance to them. So thank you. I hope to see you all in April at our face-to-face event. Thank you, and we will be getting the Q&A document out to you early next week. I appreciate your time. Thank you.